If you've watched Sister Wives from the beginning, then you remember Meri Brown as the first wife, the legal wife, the woman who helped build the entire foundation of the Brown family long before cameras, fame, or controversy entered the picture. But fast forward to today, and many viewers are left asking the same question. How did Meri go from being the anchor of this family to the most isolated figure in it? And more importantly, where is she now in 2026 after everything that has happened? Because the truth is, Meri's story didn't end when her marriage to Cody collapsed on screen. It evolved in ways that were quieter, more complex, and far more revealing than most people realize, and once you start connecting the dots, her journey looks less like a tragic footnote and more like a slow-burning transformation. That was years in the making, so stay with me. Because the deeper we go, the more this story challenges everything we thought we understood about loyalty, sacrifice, and starting over. Meri Brown entered Sister Wives as the emotional cornerstone of the family, the woman who shared Cody's early struggles, the legal spouse who navigated infertility in a plural marriage where motherhood carried enormous emotional weight, and for years, viewers watched her try to maintain her place as the family dynamics shifted around her, especially after Robin entered the picture. And while the show often framed Meri as distant or difficult, the reality beneath the surface was far more layered. Because by the time the family moved to Flagstaff, Meri was already living a life that barely resembled the plural marriage she once signed up for, emotionally disconnected from Cody, physically separated from the rest of the family, yet still financially contributing and publicly committed to the family structure. That no longer seemed to include her in any meaningful way. One of the biggest turning points in Meri's life came long before many fans realized it, and that was her legal divorce from Cody in 2014. A decision made so Cody could legally marry Robin and adopt her children. And while this was presented as a selfless act at the time, hindsight has revealed just how much Meri quietly gave up in that moment, because legally, emotionally, and symbolically, that divorce marked the beginning of her gradual detachment from the power structure of the family. And yet, she stayed, believing loyalty would eventually be rewarded or at least acknowledged. A belief that would slowly erode as the years went on. By the late 2010s, Meri's relationship with Cody had effectively ended in every way except name, a reality Cody himself admitted on camera multiple times, stating openly that he no longer considered himself married to her in a functional sense. And yet, Meri remained tied to the family financially and publicly, which created a painful contradiction that viewers could feel even when it wasn't directly addressed. Because how do you remain committed to a structure that no longer recognizes you? And how long can someone survive emotionally in that kind of limbo before they're forced to choose themselves? This question became even more urgent as Meri began focusing more intensely on her independent ventures, particularly her work with LuLaRoe and the success of Leetsy's Heritage Inn, her bed and breakfast in Utah, both of which became more than just income streams. They became lifelines, sources of identity and stability that existed completely outside of Cody and the family hierarchy. And what many fans don't realize is that these businesses didn't just give Meri financial independence, they gave her confidence, routine, and a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. And that shift subtly, but permanently changed the way she moved through the world. If you're watching right now, pause for a moment and comment below whether you think Meri's business success helped her emotionally detach from the marriage, or if you believe the emotional separation came first and pushed her toward independence. Because fans have very different opinions on which came first, and both interpretations say a lot about how people view her resilience. As the family fractures became impossible to ignore, especially following Christine's departure and Janelle's eventual separation from Cody, Meri found herself in a strange position, no longer fighting to be included, but also not yet fully stepping away. And that in-between space is where her story becomes the most fascinating. Because unlike the others, Meri didn't make a dramatic exit. She didn't explode publicly. She simply began redirecting her energy elsewhere, traveling more, spending time with friends, building community outside the family, and gradually redefining what her life looked like without centering it around a marriage that no longer existed in practice. By the time Meri officially confirmed the end of her marriage to Cody, in early 2023, many viewers felt the announcement was overdue, but what followed was unexpected. Because instead of spiraling or disappearing from public view, Meri appeared lighter, more self-assured, and increasingly open about reclaiming her sense of self. And this is where the "where are they now" question takes on real weight. Because Meri's post-marriage life isn't about scandal or collapse. It's about reconstruction, and reconstruction doesn't always look dramatic. But it is deeply powerful. Make sure you're subscribed if you want the full breakdown of Meri's journey, beyond what the show shows you. Because the next part reveals how the financial truths, emotional realizations, and long-term consequences of staying too long reshaped her future in ways no one expected. And if you know someone who still sees Meri only through her early seasons, share this video with them, because the woman she is now tells a very different story. As part 1 comes to a close, one thing becomes clear. Meri Brown's story was never about being left behind. It was about outgrowing a structure that stopped growing with her, and once you recognize that, everything that happens next makes sense, because part 2 is where we dive into the divorce fallout, the financial realities most fans overlook, and the emotional reckoning that forced Meri to finally choose herself and trust me. This is where the story gets even more revealing as part 2 unfolds. This is where Meri's story shifts from emotional survival to hard reality. Because once the marriage officially ended, the consequences weren't just personal. They were financial, logistical, and deeply revealing about how much she had been carrying quietly for years, and this is the part most viewers never fully saw on camera. Because while Sister Wives focused on arguments and confessionals, the real weight of the fallout showed up in how Meri had to reassess everything from property, ties to future security, and when you look closely at what she was left with versus what she had put in, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. For years, Meri remained financially tied to family decisions, even while being emotionally excluded, contributing to shared goals like Coyote Pass while living largely on her own. And that arrangement only made sense as long as the marriage had a future. But once Cody made it clear on camera that reconciliation was off the table, that structure stopped being complicated and started being unfair, and this is where Meri's quiet strength really begins to stand out, because instead of reacting publicly, she began recalibrating privately, asking the questions that come after denial fades. Questions about what was hers, what wasn't, and what her life needed to look like if she was going to stop waiting for change. That never came. One of the most overlooked aspects of Meri's journey is how methodical she became during this period, because by the time the separation was acknowledged publicly, Meri had already spent years building income streams that didn't depend on the family at all. And that preparation mattered, because it meant she wasn't walking away into uncertainty. She was walking away into stability she had created herself, and that's a powerful distinction, especially for someone who spent so many years being told her role was diminishing, because financial independence doesn't just provide money. It provides choice, and choice changes everything. As more details surfaced, fans began re-examining past seasons through a new lens, noticing how often Meri was physically absent from family gatherings, how rarely she was consulted on decisions, and how frequently her commitment was questioned despite her continued participation. And when you combine those moments with the reality of her financial contributions, it reframes her patience not as passivity, but as endurance, and endurance has a breaking point, especially when the person enduring realizes the cost of staying is higher than the cost of leaving. If you're still watching, take a second to comment below whether you think Meri stayed as long as she did out of loyalty, fear of starting over, or hope that things might eventually change. Because this is one of the most debated aspects of her story. And your perspective probably says a lot about how you view long-term commitment. The emotional fallout of the divorce also forced Meri to confront something deeply personal, her identity, outside of plural marriage, because for decades, her sense of self was tied to being a wife in a very specific structure. And when that structure dissolved, it left space that had to be filled with something new. And rather than rushing to redefine herself publicly, Meri took time traveling, reconnecting with friends, deepening relationships outside the family, and slowly allowing herself to exist without explanation. And that process may not be flashy, but it is incredibly real, especially for someone who spent so much of her adult life being defined by others. What made this phase particularly intense is that while Meri was finding her footing, the broader Brown family was unraveling publicly, with Christine thriving post-divorce and Janelle asserting her independence, which only highlighted how different Meri's path was. Because she wasn't chasing validation through contrast, she was building a quieter, more internal form of freedom, and that difference is why some fans misunderstood her at first, mistaking restraint for stagnation, when, in reality, restraint was exactly what allowed her to move forward without burning bridges she no longer needed. Make sure you like this video if you're appreciating this deeper look beyond the surface drama, because understanding the financial and emotional layers completely changes how Meri's choices make sense. And if you know someone who still thinks her story ended when the marriage did, share this with them, because what came after is where her growth really shows. As the dust settled from the separation, one thing became clear: Meri was no longer negotiating her worth within a system that had already made its decision. She was investing in herself fully for the first time in years. And that shift didn't just alter her present, it reshaped her future. Because once you stop waiting for permission to move on, the possibilities open up in ways that are both exciting and terrifying. And that tension sets the stage for the final part of this story, where we look at where Meri stands now in 2026. What success really looks like for her today, and why her next chapter might be the most surprising of all. Stay with me, because part 3 brings everything together: the fallout, the healing, and the quiet success that no one predicted. And by the end, you may see Meri Brown in a completely different light. This is where the question, where is Meri Brown now in 2026, finally gets its full answer. Because the most important part of her story isn't what she left behind, it's what she built after. She stopped centering her life around a family structure that no longer served her. And this chapter is quieter than the chaos that came before it, but it's also far more telling. Because success doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up as peace, consistency, and the absence of constant emotional negotiation. And that is exactly where Meri finds herself today. By 2026, Meri's life looks fundamentally different from the woman viewers first met on Sister Wives. Not because she reinvented herself overnight, but because she finally allowed her life to operate without apology or explanation. And that shift is visible in how she spends her time, how she talks about her past, and how she defines success on her own terms. Because instead of chasing reconciliation or validation, Meri has leaned fully into independence, focusing on her businesses, her personal growth, and the relationships that offer mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. One of the clearest indicators of Meri's stability in 2026 is her continued financial independence, with Felici's heritage in remaining a central passion project rather than just a business, representing something she built entirely on her own, separate from the Brown family identity and combined with her long-standing work in direct sales. This financial security has allowed her something she didn't have for most of her adult life: choice, the ability to decide where she lives, how she travels, who she surrounds herself with, and what she no longer tolerates. And that freedom quietly answers many of the questions fans once asked about whether she would struggle. After leaving the marriage, emotionally, Meri appears more grounded and self-aware than ever before, openly acknowledging the pain of her past without allowing it to define her future. And that balance is important because healing doesn't mean pretending something didn't hurt. It means refusing to live inside that hurt forever and in interviews and social media interactions. Meri has shown a level of reflection that suggests she has done the internal work many people avoid. Work that doesn't generate headlines but fundamentally changes how someone experiences their life. If you've stayed with me this long, comment below and answer this honestly. Do you think Meri's version of success looks quieter than what people expected because we're conditioned to expect chaos after divorce? Or do you think this calm outcome is exactly what she deserved after years of emotional strain? Because this question really gets to the heart of how we define winning. In situations like this, what makes Meri's present situation even more compelling is how little she seems interested in rewriting the past publicly. Because instead of assigning blame or relitigating old conflicts, she has focused on accountability without obsession, acknowledging what happened, learning from it, and moving forward without needing closure from the people who couldn't give it to her, and that mindset is often the final stage of emotional independence. The moment when someone realizes that peace doesn't come from answers, it comes from acceptance. From a broader perspective, Meri's journey has reshaped how many fans interpret Sister Wives as a whole. Because her outcome challenges the idea that staying the longest means failing the hardest, and instead suggests that endurance, while costly, can eventually lead to clarity, and that clarity can become the foundation for a life that feels intentional rather than reactive. And that is a powerful takeaway for viewers who saw pieces of themselves in her struggle. Before we wrap up, make sure you're subscribed. If you want more long-form breakdowns like this that focus on real timelines and emotional truth, instead of surface-level drama, and if this story gave you a new perspective on Meri, hit the like button so it reaches other fans who might still be stuck viewing her through the lens of earlier seasons. And finally, share this video with someone who followed Sister Wives from the beginning, because the full arc of Meri's story is only visible when you look at where she started and where she stands now. In the end, Meri Brown's Where Are They Now story in 2026 isn't defined by divorce fallout alone. It's defined by resilience, self-reliance, and the quiet confidence that comes from no longer needing to fight for space in someone else's world, because she finally built her own, and that may be the most successful ending anyone could have hoped for. Not just for Meri, but for anyone who has ever stayed too long, learned too late, and still found a way forward.